Congressman John Rose, a Republican from Tennessee and a member of the House Financial Services Committee. My colleague Bob Cusack, our editor-in-chief, recently sat down with him. Let's have a listen.
Congressman Rose, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Cusack. Thank you for having me.
Oh, please call me Bob. Now, you spearheaded a bipartisan letter to the SEC regarding a regulation on ESG, climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it got going?
Well, so I serve on the Financial Services Committee, but I'm also a farmer. I have an operating farm. And so that when I saw this proposed rulemaking from the Securities and Exchange Commission and started to read into it and see the details, it really heightened my concern about how this would impact agriculture, particularly small farmers who would ultimately be reached by this rule. And so as I started to talk around with other members and with some of the organizations that represent agriculture, they shared that concern, and that's what really gave rise to us sending this letter, which is just really calling out the concern to the SEC that their proposed rulemaking could have vast unintended consequences, or perhaps intended consequences on small farmers all across this country.
You sent the letter in May, and you've asked for a response by June 24th. Have you received a response? And obviously, this is a pressing issue because it's an ongoing rulemaking.
Yeah, we have not yet received a response, and I suspect that the SEC probably is being overwhelmed with comments. So, if past example is any precedent for what we might see here, it could be some time before we get a response.
As far as the comment period, you want, because it's such a complicated rule as government regulations are, you want the comment period extended. Is that right?
Well, absolutely. So initially, the SEC, I think, in a very unreasonable position, provided a very short comment period for a rule that is 510 pages in length and has 1,068 technical footnotes to it, and they provided just over a 30-day comment period. They have now extended it, but I think because of the stutter step there, it would be appropriate to provide from this juncture a full 90-day comment period so that stakeholders have the broadest possible opportunity to respond to what will be a very impactful rule if ultimately it goes into effect.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from your constituents on this, maybe farmers back home?
Sure. Well, very positive. I think to some extent, it's a wake-up call to farmers who don't spend every day poring over historically, in particular, the Securities and Exchange Commission rulemakings. You know, farmers are regulated by a raft of federal, state, and local agencies of one sort or another. They're not used to being regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And frankly, I think the SEC has stepped over its bounds here by proposing a rule that would touch individual sole proprietor farmers all across this country.
And if this rule were to go in effect, how would it, in your view, affect the food supply chain?
Well, I think it will have a deterrent effect on the supply of food, and ultimately it will have a negative impact on the price, because I think anytime you burden agriculture and farmers in particular with more regulations, it's going to have a negative effect on their ability to supply food and fiber. As one of my friends says, when you've got plenty to eat, you have lots of problems, but when you're hungry, you've got one problem. Well, this is going to burden farmers who work from dawn to dusk every day, usually to produce. They don't have extensive staff, certainly don't have compliance departments that are toiling away, trying to figure out what sort of new federal regulations they need to comply with. So farmers are going to be asked to do this. It's going to take away from their core responsibilities and make it harder for them to make ends meet. And it's going to have other intended impacts that I think are going to be negative for the food supply. It will cause greater concentration of production, in my opinion, because farmers that are unable to meet this stringent requirement of providing this information or unable to do so, they're going to fall by the wayside. In fact, the rule itself suggests that the companies that are complying with the Scope 3 disclosures should seek out suppliers or customers who are better able to comply with these requirements that are being envisioned by the SEC.
As far as the rule, do you see merit in companies providing more information along these lines, and SEC has just gone too far in the scope of it, or are you concerned about the movement as well, maybe just going too far? It is a trendy kind of issue right now.
Right. Well, what I would say is I think this is beyond the scope of what the SEC is supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be making sure that we have marketplaces that protect investors. They're supposed to be encouraging the creation of capital and making sure that rules are followed. They're not supposed to be making up social policy or enforcing it, in my view. And so I think if this is to be done, it's the province of the Congress to take up these questions and decide if these are issues that merit further federal interference in the free enterprise system and further compliance by our businesses across the country, and not the place of the SEC that necessarily, I believe, number one, is going to be distracted from their core purposes that Congress did empower them to pursue. And number two, I think they're going to inundate investors, the very people that they are supposed to be trying to make sure have adequate information to make proper and competent judgments about the risk that they're taking. They're going to inundate them with a whole host of new information that in many cases may not really be material to the investment decisions that investors need to make. And so they're going to now have to wade through all of this ESG stuff, environmental disclosure that comes out of this rule, and try to sort through for themselves which of those disclosures are actually relevant for the companies that they're trying to make investment decisions about.
You mentioned the scope and the responsibilities of the SEC. I mean, do you think that if this rule is finalized, that it's going to end up in court as is?
Absolutely. And as an attorney, not a securities lawyer, by the way, but and I consider myself to be a recovering lawyer, but that these kinds of rules will just be a haven for the plaintiff's bar. They will want to test every nook and cranny of this new rule, and so we can expect a profound amount of litigation as we try to sort out the definitions, the meanings, the depth, the contours of this new rule. So it will be expensive for shareholders whose companies that they invest in are going to have to foot the bill for the legal challenges that will make their way through the courts. And ultimately, the fear of litigation, as we know, so often drives decisions in marketplaces by producers and market participants. And so you're going to see a lot of defensive moves made by companies to try to avoid being the test case, if you will. And so they're going to be incentivized to try to avoid that by maybe going above and beyond what even the SEC might have envisioned if this rule comes to be put in place. And so all of that is going to just be a immense regulatory burden on the industry at large, the investment community at large. And if it touches agriculture in the way that I anticipate, it will increase costs for farmers at the very smallest level across this country.
Was it hard? You got a lot of signatures on your letter, including Democrats, Congresswoman Luria, as well as Slotkin on there. Was it? And people forget that there are basically farms in every district. People think there's farmland and non-farmland. But was it hard, getting people to sign on to that? And especially in these polarizing times, you're able to get Democrats to sign on too.
Sure. Surprisingly, it was not. I think most members of Congress immediately, when you explain particularly the impact of the Scope 3 disclosures, they almost to a number start nodding their head and saying, oh, yeah, that's a real problem. We can't let that happen. The SEC has gone beyond its mandate and is outside of its lane.
Last question. The way the midterms are looking and the way the president's job approval numbers are right now, very likely that the House will flip in November. Should the House flip and the administration doesn't bend, do you think there could be legislation looking to overturn this that the new House Republican majority would bring to the floor?
Absolutely. I would expect that if this rule was to be implemented in anything akin to the way it's been proposed, I think you would see legislation to try to turn that back. Obviously, the question is whether the administration would allow that to happen and whether there would be the congressional will at the level of overturning administrative action. But I think ultimately you'll see this regulation, whether it be in the next Congress or in the next administration, whenever that time may come, you'll see this turned back. And one of the things that I would just reiterate is that, we go to the store shelves and we see no baby formula and we wonder, why did that happen? Well, it's misguided policies like the one that you see the SEC and Chairman Gensler advancing here that ultimately lead to these breakdowns in the free market and scarcity that seems to have no explanation sometimes. And so the folks listening need to know this overreach, this regulatory overreach is going to have profound and unintended consequences that will ripple out over time. That will make this economy less efficient, increase costs for everyone, and ultimately perhaps lead to levels of deprivation that we don't expect.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely a big regulation that's gotten a lot of attention and headlines. Congressman Rose, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bob, and Congressman John Rose, Republican from Tennessee and a member of the House Financial Services Committee.